Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online social psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in group processes. Now, some of these constructs were reviewed in previous classes, such as Gen Psychology, but in this course, we're going to dive into more depth in those same constructs. So I'll try to accelerate my review of portions of those constructs that have already been covered in previous classes, and then spend more time on parts of those constructs that have not been previously covered. All right, with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with, what is a group? Baby's first group. Our first construct will be Entitativity, the degree to which a collection of people feel like a cohesive group. Features of cohesive group which can increase Entitativity include a sense of a common bond, that is a degree to which people interact and depend on one another. Types of interactions include communal sharing. A common quote or way to think about this is, what's yours is mine. And market pricing. I will wash your back if you wash mine. Common identity is the degree to which groups share similar characteristics. People feel a, quote, we-ness or shared attachment to groups that they belong to. Gender, race, class can include sharing a flag or a mascot, for example. This can stem from supporting the same cause or working on a goal. Collective challenge or threat can stimulate common identity. It can be frictional. So keeping it broad here, kind of the group, the strength of the group, depending on the degree to which members interact and depend on one another. So every single day, for example, you can wake up, for example, and go to, and you have community childcare or something like that, or within your specific group, I should say. But beyond kind of sharing responsibilities, maybe everybody goes out on whatever Tuesdays or some kind of special event wherein all the families come together and you interact with each other and build that sense of common bond. And through time, again, this creates this common identity. Instead of, for me personally as a unique individual, we now have a we-ness. We have, you've probably heard of attachment, but now we have a shared attachment to the group. And these groups can vary on various demographic differences, class differences. So they can be just kind of proximal in nature, but also groups can form when working towards a collective goal. So whatever, a political goal, a social goal, economic goal, whatever it is. And groups typically share some kind of symbols and or iconography, which is kind of a visual representation of said group. And again, that we-ness, who you are. So you have your quote unquote individual self and then this collective self. So why do people join and identify with groups? They can promote survival and achieving goals. People form close bonds within kinship groups and with non-kin groups in the vicinity because they would not survive very long without the cooperation of others. Over the course of evolution, humans depended on social networks to acquire and share food, transmit information, rear children, and avoid predators and other threats. With this environment, individuals with characteristics that help them get along with others, such as desire for social acceptance, cooperation, and loyalty, have better chances of living long enough to pass on their genes to future generations. So here we kind of have like a natural selection situation wherein we have kind of groups of humans, thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, needing each other to survive. So you can even imagine or like early Bronze Age, or maybe before that, limited tools that can be shared. So you have people you can depend on, again, sharing food, rearing children together, but also transmitting information. So instead of just seeing the world through your individual eyes, but learning from other people, which allows for greater knowledge production, planning, and ultimately a higher chance of survival. So personality characteristics kind of associated with kind of this group survival goals, including social acceptance, loyalty, cooperation, through time kind of naturally selected to kind of influence us as a species. So humans, again, very ultra social group species. Humans have been characterized that by some scholars because of the level and the dependence we have on other social people and other humans. There are very few moments, if ever, in your life that you're not listening to someone, talking to someone, thinking about something, or thinking about someone, or being around someone else. Group membership has enhanced survival, so adaptive tendency to identify with kinship groups. Natural selection process. Modern humans might possess an innate desire to belong to groups and to avoid being kicked out of them. So through this collective process of survival and achieving goals, of collective dependence on each other, the group membership and the identifying with the group is characterized as adaptive tendencies. Because now you are part of that group. You literally identify with that group, and as such, you are going to collaborate with that group, sacrifice for that group, think about that group, and trying to theoretically improve the quality of said group. And being kicked out of that group can be quite dangerous. Again, lower chance of survival and kind of a much more lonely life versus kind of being in this kind of collective group. Continuing on, groups contribute to goal completion. People form and join groups to accomplish goals they would be unlikely to accomplish on their own. Most human achievements require the coordination of many people working in groups. So stopping there, you can think about all inventions today are based on and leverage previously conducted experiments in science and knowledge. No quote-unquote new invention is itself purely new. It always relies on previous scientific research. Again, demonstrating to you the collective nature of information gathering and scientific invention, of creativity, and beyond kind of just invention. You can imagine just like a construction building or something along those lines. People working together in a group to achieve something that they would be unable to do so independently. At school or at work, people are more successful when they work in tight-knit groups of friends rather than acquaintances, according to research from Chung in 2018. Bringing to one's minds one's membership in a group increases the probability of people feeling more in control of their lives and capable of acting effectively, especially if the group is stable. So kind of the idea or one interpretation of this French study or the impact of working with friends versus acquaintances is kind of the idea that friends, again, you kind of have this shared common bond. You have sets of expectations that people depend on you, and you identify meaning through that friendship. And consequently, as well, you don't want to theoretically, if you have a good friend and not a friend of me, you do not want to let your friend down. So you are going to maybe try harder and maybe be able to communicate more effectively with this friend. The sense of personal control gained from group identification improves people's satisfaction with life. This is associated with a decrease of helplessness and depression. Shifting one's thinking from, quote, me to, quote, we increases self-efficacy beliefs. One/we can attain goals. So here again, kind of the idea is we have this group. You have a new identity, and this new identity can bring new aspirations, new visions forward, new hope moving forward. Because now you don't have to think, okay, I cannot, broadly saying, build a house by myself. Now I have this group of people, my fellow construction workers or whatever. Now my helplessness has decreased, and depression can be. There's multiple ways to interpret this. One, just kind of social isolation increases the risk of depression, but also, again, kind of depression being correlated with helplessness. So the sense that, there's nothing you can do. As an individual in general in life, for at least the world's largest problems, there's very little you can do. You can feel helpless. But belonging to a group wherein this group is stable, you identified, you have a strong common bond, now you have a vision for the future. It is possible to dream and imagine said future and thus decrease rates of depressive symptoms. Your self-efficacy increases the idea that you are capable or we are capable of achieving something in the context of the group. Now you believe you have greater control of your life. Even if the odds are difficult, you have a collective that you can lean on. This kind of a collective courage that can occur in group settings, kind of motivating people to and contributing to people accomplishing goals that they otherwise would not be able to do independently. So you kind of have like a social benefit of social evaluation of yourself, and then kind of the group being rooted in kind of your material reality, your conditions, your environment. And theoretically, your group is working on that environment for whatever reason. That work in itself can improve your satisfaction with life, your purpose, and your belief that you can change, theoretically, your environment, your material conditions for the good. Groups can also reduce uncertainty. The uncertainty identity theory argues that people join and identify with groups in order to reduce negative feelings of uncertainty about themselves and others. Now, why might that be? Because groups reinforce a cultural worldview. Groups prescribe norms and rules about how people should act and think. This provides this consensus through explicit routes, such as formal codes of conduct, and implicit routes, value-laden rituals, helping group members feel certain about how the world works. So stopping there, groups, again, give you sets of rules, norms, roles, a greater understanding of the world, which can thus reduce negative feelings of uncertainty for yourself as a quote-unquote individual. So now you have a greater framework to understand the world. You have a role within that world. You have expectations of behavior. And there are multiple ways that groups enforce these cultural worldviews. Again, explicit routes, such as formal codes of conduct. So you cannot say X, Y, Z. You cannot do A, B, C. So literally, it is against the rules to behave in a certain way or think in a certain way. And then more implicitly, so value-laden rituals. And every culture, every group has these kind of rituals, and these rituals reinforce these cultural worldviews. So just whatever, you can think of graduation, for example. In the United States, it's like this big thing, and whatever. It's supposed to be like the idea here implicitly is that you worked, and sometimes directly, is you worked really hard, and now through your efforts, you have graduated. It kind of validates the United States kind of like cultural, political, and economic, social worldviews. See, you've worked your way through this like kind of fair process. You graduated, and now you get to enter the world and whatever, more social meaning and more money or something along those lines. But ultimately, that ritual represents the values within in the country. In this case, the United States or other countries as well. Most beliefs about reality can never be, quote, proven through personal experience. For example, Earth revolves around the sun. This is not seen firsthand. Confidence in these beliefs comes from social consensus. As more people share a belief, the truer it seems to be. So basically, the idea here can be that the larger the group is, the more credibility a person can believe, because now you think that there's a social consensus around these things that you really have never, ever seen directly firsthand. Most things in the world you're not going to experience personally. This is why the concept, the books, and kind of like the scientific consensus. But here at a group level, there's also consensuses about like worldviews and norms and roles that vary in confidence or credibility or legitimacy, partially influenced by kind of this idea of social consensus. Again, more people share the belief, the truer it seems to be. Let's operationally define norms and roles. Norms are rules for how group members ought to behave. Most norms are unspoken agreements about what behavior is acceptable or unacceptable, but they can also be made explicit. Students told that most students at their university limit how much junk food they eat were then less interested in chowing down on other junk food, according to a 2019 study. So norms are everywhere across kind of cultures. So whatever, how do you, where do you put your hands at a dinner table? How do you act at a funeral? How do you act in a classroom? In general, these are not on the first day of university class. Many of these rules are not talked about, or whatever. You go to a funeral, like, the person in charge is not like, okay, this is the rules of the funeral. You have an understanding, an unspoken understanding that are culturally kind of passed down within groups or cultures and subcultures that explain how you should behave in a particular situation. Next, we have roles, expectations of how people who hold certain positions in the group ought to behave. Captain of a soccer team can typically make decisions that other team members are not allowed to make. So now we have roles, and so you can think of this as, again, a captain of a soccer team has a specific role, and they should behave in a certain way. They have different expectations and permissions on how they behave. They can, whatever, criticize their players. They can make adjustments to the team, whatever. You can, whatever, a student and a professor, a mother and a child. These things are different. These are specific social roles, and in those roles have kind of collections of, again, expectations about how that person should behave. Group members do not have to wonder how they'll act in a given situation. Perspective leads to a hypothesis. In situations in which people feel uncertain about who they are, they will identify more with groups, behave particularly cohesive groups that offer a clear identity. When threats to personal significance make people feel uncertain about themselves, they become especially attractive to ideologies that promise clear-cut guidelines of how to live. So this argument leverages the uncertainty identity theory. Again, the idea that people join and identify with groups in order to reduce negative feelings of uncertainty about themselves and others. The kind of idea here is you make a person feel uncertain about who they are, what is their meaning in life, and in those circumstances, they will leverage the group to again provide as a source of identity and expectations about the world around them. So if you make a person feel uncertain who belongs to a group, they're going to increase that certainty, that identity within their group to kind of offset that uncertainty and resolve, because the group now gives them sets of expectations, norms, and roles on how to behave. And when a person's personal significance, or kind of like their meaning in life, their place in the universe or whatever, something along those lines, you're uncertain, you're worthless, I'm just a little speck in the universe. Now, and under those conditions, people have a greater likelihood to subscribe to ideologies, which in all ideologies provide clear-cut guidelines on how to live, again, rules, norms, expectations. So kind of reducing that uncertainty that I'm just nothing in this grand scheme of life. Now I'm part of a group, and this group now has a purpose, and I'm connected to other people. It's not just me by myself as a speck. I'm now part of other specks, and theoretically these specks have a legacy of decades beforehand that now you are a part of, and that can continue on into the future, allowing you to kind of maintain a sense of kind of permanence and purpose within your brief lifespan. Groups can also increase self-esteem. The social identity theory argues that a person's understanding of who they are is shaped by group memberships. Group identities are an important part of self-definition and are a key source of self-esteem. They are sources of meaningful social connections. Groups don't need to be big or successful to boost their self-esteem. Being part of small groups, rich with supportive interactions, can increase self-evaluation. So here, especially for kind of U.S. listeners out there, this theory argues that group identities are fundamental to yourself. They, again, give you in this case here, provide you with a sense of self-esteem, a higher or more positive sense kind of self. So thus your identity is social in nature. So thus social identity. I mean, identity and it's kind of, and that identity is influenced by collective, aka kind of the social world around you. There are many possible reasons for this. One is meaningful social connections. You're in a group. The group members theoretically care about each other in some regard, but ultimately you provide meaningful social connections. You both have certain sets of expectations. You're chasing a certain goal, a certain struggle, whatever it is. But ultimately, being in that group, interacting with those people is meaningful. They give you a sense of purpose, and thus kind of contributing to a higher, more positive view of the self, aka self-esteem. So again, a group has kind of a way of giving you kind of, broadly speaking, this is kind of a little woo-woo, social energy that allows you to imagine yourself doing things that you couldn't otherwise do, and evaluating yourself in different ways, literally kind of shaping, molding yourself to maybe theoretically a more positive view of yourself and what you're capable of, and what your group is, and consequently, I guess I should say, what your group is capable of. Next, managing mortality concerns, and we already alluded to this in previous breakdown with our specs analysis, but kind of to further clarify, group membership strengthens feelings of connectedness to something bigger and longer lasting than personal experience. While death is inevitable, people can take solace from belonging to an ancestral line, a national religious group, a political organization, a scientific/artist field, or some other adoring group that provides a sense that some part of them will live on in a symbolic sense. People need to cope with the threatening knowledge of their mortality. Scholars argue they do so by clinging to two psychological resources: faith and a cultural worldview, and a sense of self-esteem. Studies in support of this idea show that people who are reminded of their death, in comparison to other negative topics, tend to view their country, religious organization, or other groups to which they belong to more favorably, and as higher in entitativity and longevity. So again, we already had the spec breakdown. You're nothing. You're nobody but yourself. You're where you're going to die. Here, the group allows you to feel that you're something bigger than yourself. You're either, pursuing a political struggle. You're pursuing a scientific advancement. You're some kind of art project, a religious group, a national group, racial group, whatever it is. But ultimately, you belong to something bigger than yourself. And when you inevitably die, you know that, okay, well, this fight, this struggle, this identity, this group will continue on. So part of you continues on. You live with other people, all these kind of things. And consequently, the people who came before you live within you. You can see yourself in history, and you can see yourself into the future, before you were born and after you are dead. This connectivity across generations, across people, across time, allows you to, again, have a kind of a greater sense of meaning, because it's kind of like a historical legacy that you are part of. Cooperation in groups. Because cooperation is critical for groups to develop trade and build economic relationships, some scholars who study the psychology of cooperation and trust are interested in behavioral economics and decision-making. Social dilemmas in the science of cooperations. Social dilemmas pit self-interest against a larger social goal. The most well-known social dilemma is the prisoner's dilemma. So as I talked about in kind of the introduction to this class, psychology and all social sciences in general are going to be interdisciplinary because psychology is going to not just exist in this vacuum of like, oh, your family, how does my family treat me? What are the impact of that? No, but this is literally the study of behavior, just kind of broadly stated. And those understandings of behaviors are embedded in our political, social, and economic systems. Or I should say, those systems itself also kind of produce values and expectations on how people should behave, and then we kind of learn those growing up. So in this case here, we have kind of economists researching kind of group dynamics, and we'll talk about specifically the prisoner's dilemma. So in the prisoner's dilemma, you decide between cooperating and competing with a partner. Your decision depends on how much you trust your partner to cooperate with you. So look at the image to the right-hand side. Imagine you are prisoner A. What would you do? You can confess and snitch on your partner. Or number 2, remain silent. Recognize that snitches get stitches. Now, at the heart of the prisoner's dilemma is a very basic decision. Can I trust you, or can't I trust you? If I can't trust you, I better protect myself, because you're going to end up snitching on me. Once this trust is there, both sides compete with each other. So the idea of prisoner's dilemma is, in a scenario where there's 2 prisoners, A and B, the way that we're both free is by remaining silent. So if we both remain silent, then we both get off. However, again, this relies on mutual trust. And if that trust is not there, then prisoner A or B, or A and B can both confess, can cop the pleas, and get out early. And this can then contribute to kind of a downward spiral where we're both snitching on each other as fast as possible. Next, resource dilemmas. These are distribution games about resource dilemmas are constructed so one person or group decides resource distribution. People often distribute money equally, even though it clearly would be in their self-interest to take the whole pot and give nothing to the recipient. So you have the option, keep the money all for yourself or give it to someone else. In general, people will split up that money, even though keeping the money theoretically would be beneficial to their self-interest. Next, the common dilemma. The word commons is thought to derive from medieval times, when people would bring their herds to the town commons to graze. Although it was in everyone's self-interest to keep the commons healthy, overgrazing by each individual farmer could easily spell the destruction of the resource, creating the, quote, tragedy of the commons. Using a scarce resource benefits you, but hurts the whole group. For example, environmental conservation issues. Because these problems are caused by groups, the solutions also require groups. For example, although you might take pro-environmental actions like eating less meat and biking to work, you will not see the impact of these choices on climate change alone. A solution requires group members to identify with the group and change norms together, according to a 2018 study. So here we have the common dilemma, and kind of the commons is kind of like shared resources, commonly thought of as kind of like environmental resources. So if you live in Florida, the beach, something along those lines. Those are commons that we can all go to and share. They theoretically do not belong to anybody specifically, or whatever, some big park or public park or something like that. So the idea here is that everybody's in self-interest to keep the commons in good shape because we all use it, we all depend on it. So we live on a beach area, everybody doesn't want to trash the beach, or no one can go to the beach. There's crap everywhere. Now we've ruined the beach. You can imagine some person's, throwing crap all over the beach. Now no one can use it. So it's in everyone's theoretical self-interest to keep the commons healthy so we can all use it. However, overusing the land, overgrazing the farm, can begin a downward spiral wherein the tragedy of commons. The common is now destroyed, or people have lost trust in each other to manage the common, and now the beach is destroyed. And kind of these, and then kind of working through the rest of it, is the idea that kind of group problems require group solutions. So going back to the commons example with a beach person, one person can't be like, okay, well, I'm just not going to litter. And if everybody else is littering, then you're paddling upstream. You can't win. The beach is destroyed. So a group problem requires kind of a group solution. So kind of the idea here with climate change, eat less meat, you can bike to work, save on or decrease kind of your carbon output, but ultimately you will not see impacts in the amount of total CO2 emissions in the world because it is a group problem. You could take to the woods and just eat dirt the rest of your life. Guess what? Climate change. CO2 can still increase. Why is that? Because your own individual choices, your own individual behaviors by themselves are incapable of resolving a collective problem, a tragedy of the commons, in this case, climate change. Thus, the need for kind of group solutions. Now, of course, what that group solution is, what those group identities are going to vary depending on a person's political and economic ideologies. Moving on to public goods dilemma. This is a valued resource, I should say, continues to exist only if everyone contributes to its support. Local blood banks, libraries, and public radio and television are all examples of public goods that endure only because enough people chip in to keep them going. Solving a public goods dilemma requires cooperation and contributions, for example, taxes, so that resource can be maintained. Both kinds of dilemmas face the problem of free riders, individuals who take more than their fair share from the common pool. So we have these public goods, these goods, these resources, these institutions that exist due to hashtag we live in a society. We have a local government thing or an organization, whatever, but it's ultimately a public good. It's a good, a resource for the collective, the public. So whatever, you can imagine like a blood bank. Theoretically, X amount of people have to donate to blood banks to keep them functioning. If everybody doesn't contribute to a blood bank, there is no blood bank. And one way to compel people to contribute to a public good, a blood bank, a library, public PBS, something like that for viewers like you, one is taxes. So then you can just pay for the resource and whatever the upkeep required. All right, let's talk about distribution games. These games are constructed so one person or group decides resource distribution. In the Ultimatum game, one person called the, quote, decider is given a real sum of money and told she can decide how much to keep and how much to give to a different person. In the Dictator game, it's kind of similar to the Ultimatum game, except the recipient doesn't have the option of, quote, punishing the decider by rejecting his or her offer. Theoretically allows researchers to look at how people's reactions to unfair distribution of resources. So kind of the idea here of the Dictator game is that the person who receives the money or the goods or whatever it is can either, or does not, I should say, have the option of rejecting the offer that's given to you. So the amount of money, the amount of candy, whatever it is. Instead, they just have to take it. So you watch somebody, the dictator of the game, say whatever. There's 10 pieces of candy. They keep 9 and they give you 1. You do not have the option of rejecting that one offer, the one piece of candy. So kind of the idea here is that researchers can measure a person's reaction to unfair distribution of resources because we don't give them an opt-out of not accepting the offer. So when and why do people cooperate? Let's start with the wins. There are situational factors, that is the saliency of social norms. Different norms are salient in the person's immediate context, so more accessible, greater effect of a norm within a particular context. So when a prisoner's dilemma was labeled a community game, for example, participants chose to cooperate on twice the number of trials as when the same dilemma was called the Wall Street game. So here, this situational factor, that is the name of the game, can activate certain norms. So community game, you can think maybe the norms of sharing are more salient. Versus the Wall Street game, kind of the norms of kind of maximizing profit, for example, can be more salient. Also, personality traits, not really strong predictors, very inconsistent, but the most salient predictor of cooperation is agreeableness. So how much you're willing to kind of agree with the group, but really kind of more a degree of kind of personable, maybe. It is one of the big 5 personality traits. This is kind of associated with sympathy, cooperation, honesty, and kind of warmth. So you can see here how kind of those behaviors being associated with agreeableness could increase the frequency and the degree of cooperation. There's also cultural influences. People from collective cultures do cooperate more sometimes, but much more likely when they are interacting with friends. When acting with strangers, collectivists can be more competitive. So, a 2005 study, for example, when Chinese Americans were primed to think about their Chinese identity rather than their American identity, they were more cooperative when playing with friends, but not when playing with strangers. So kind of the idea here is there are different individualism versus collectivism is a dichotomy that just really exists. It is a continuum, and there are also different forms of collectivist norms. And in some collectivist cultures, kind of the idea here is that you are more cooperative, considerate, taking the considerations of people within your collective, but people outside this collective, you're less likely to care, maybe greater likelihood of being competitive. So the collective very strong, but outside the collective more competitive. So in this case here, we have Chinese Americans, so bicultural participants, Chinese identity and American identity. Again, we're kind of bifurcating it here, not really the case, but for the purposes of simplicity here, we are priming the Chinese identity, making a person think about their Chinese identity unconsciously, increasing the saliency of the Chinese identity, and thus kind of values and norms associated with that identity. So in those cases, when Chinese Americans are primed about their Chinese identity, they're more likely to be cooperative with friends, but again, possibly, but not when playing with strangers. Again, strangers outside of your collective. So important to just not be like, all right, collective means we love everyone, kind of a situation. Not the case. Why? We kind of have 2 biological and neurological reasons here. We have oxytocin and kind of dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex activation. For the nerds out there, the neuroscience nerds, those are kind of placements on the brain, or where exactly in the brain the prefrontal cortex area that you're talking about is. So those dorsal lateral are kind of like directions. Now, when we look at why, it's important to not think of this as causation. Okay, this is much more closer to correlation. And what we know about correlation, just because 2 things are correlated does not mean that those things, that one variable is causing the other. This can be confusing for new students or especially new neurobiology and neuroscience students. Just because there's a biological reaction or neurological activity associated with a human behavior does not mean that that biological reaction or a pattern of neural activity is causing the behavior. So you can imagine me sitting around reading books every single day, and then I'm just going to make up something. I have a kind of increase in the amount of neuroreceptors and synaptic connections within my hippocampus. So I'm reading every day, and my hippocampus is going, it's getting better or whatever. It's horrible, not how it works, but whatever. Just having more white matter, if you want to be technical about it, but whatever. So you would not say that my hippocampus, the increased white matter, is causing me to read more or causing me to read or interpret the text more, but rather me reading is contributing to kind of an increase in the amount of white matter within my hippocampus. Now, in return, those neurological, neurobio shifts can kind of work the other way and then increase my ability to read. So working in this multi-directional or bi-directional process of kind of a biological reaction to my behavior and then theoretically, kind of depending on my age, kind of restructuring or modifying parts of my brain that is associated with that activity, aka reading. So thus why, and speaking for someone who wrote I should say a peer or a colleague with someone who wrote a meta-analysis on oxytocin, the idea that you just take oxytocin and then you start behaving positively or something along those lines does not work. You cannot just take oxytocin and then all of a sudden everybody's magically happy and very cooperative. Now, what these neurological indicators can tell you is where in parts of your brain, for example, or what networks in your brain are implicated with or associated with particular behaviors and actions like math or reading or whatever, social communication stuff like that. And thus maybe what areas to target intervention for stroke or dementia or some other kind of decay and breakdown in certain neurological networks. For example, could be one application. Evidence for a universally evolved mechanism for fairness and pro-social behaviors found in cooperation in decision-making studies. When chimpanzees play a version of the Ultimatum game and one partner makes an unfair offer, the recipient hisses and spits at the other chimp, even while grudgingly accepting it. So kind of the idea here is that we have this, again, through natural evolution, through the development of our species, in other kind of related species, or, depending on the specific species of apes. And in this case, the great ape chimpanzee, when they play the ultimate game and they get an unfair offer, there's 10 candies, they get one candy offered to them, they will take it, but they're not going to be happy about it. Again, kind of suggesting that there are kind of biological mechanisms of fairness that are universal across our species, humans, and possibly other great apes with varying degrees. Enforcement of fairness norms, however, vary across cultures as these develop to help govern the needs of expanding societal networks. So stopping there, kind of the idea here is that although you may think like, oh, it's a small scale community, therefore they're going to be a lot more cooperative. In a big, large-scale industrialized society, you can imagine a city wherein people are less personable or maybe less cooperative and helpful. Yet we see in this study, these results, that the small-scale communities members were more likely to make very low offers. And one interpretation of this from this 2010 study was that in large-scale societies wherein you don't know the majority of people around you, those societies disproportionately depend on strong fairness rules to kind of keep society together. So because we don't know everyone, we can't see everyone, we're not going to interact with most people, we have to then instead rely on these norms within our society that people are going to behave a certain way. Versus a small scale community wherein theoretically you know everyone or much more likely to know more people and therefore do not have to rely on kind of more abstract norms, strong norms, because you know everybody. You do not have to go to the store and then from whatever, some local grocery store and then buy meat and just be like, well, I wonder if that person's a good person. No, instead you have norms, expectations, through laws and stuff like this that allows people to, in large-scale societies, to assume that certain behaviors are going to be collectively performed in order to keep kind of society running properly. And thus, when people violate those rules, aka in this case here, only distributing 2 or 3 of the 10 candies to me instead of splitting it 50-50, people are in large-scale societies are much more likely to reject any offer below that 20 or 30%. It is a violation of our norms that we need to survive. So your people in these societies are far more likely to say, screw that, this is a shit offer, I don't accept it. This is outside the expectations of our culture. We also have historical factors which can erode trust development and curtail economic development. Well said. African countries that were most affected by the slave trade have seen the least amount of economic development and also exhibit the lowest levels of trust. The argument is people in former slave or African slave trading countries worried about being tricked or sold into slavery A culture of mistrust developed that has impeded political and economic cooperation even long after the demise of the slave trade. And this is why, going back to my introduction again, for developmental psychologists or social psychologists, history important, because history, these economic systems, these political systems impact the present. So in this case here, the argument being that where a context wherein people are being abducted constantly and kind of just basically disappearing by the thousands. In that context, you have a greater probability of forming mistrust, which can negatively impact the various kind of personal and countrywide outcomes. Now, of course, these historical factors don't exist in a vacuum. It was not only the slave trade, it was not the only kind of negative extractive industry or conditions that exist, but rather, again, kind of different forms of it continue to exist and to this day, and still negatively impact outcomes. But the point being, historical factors can create conditions in which, in the developmental environments, in which certain behaviors are more or less likely. In this case here, trust. And as we've also should be note, though, however, because this is kind of social in nature, these norms can be broken through their governments. Again, we'll talk about throughout this class. Governments fall, governments rise, new things happen, new forms of governments and economic systems emerge. For example, 1950s, 40s, 60s, the majority of basically the countries in the world come into being. So these are all relatively kind of recent phenomenons within the last 80 years or so. So although these historical factors play a role, they're in no way permanently determinative. Performance in a social context. Social facilitation theory argues that the presence of others increases a person's dominant response in a performance situation, the response that is most likely for that person for that particular task. The mere presence of others heightens arousal, which improves performance. So these are the classic seminal studies from Triplett in 1898 with cyclists and fishing rods. Most of the kids tested were faster at reeling in the cord when they were competing than when they were performing alone, a finding that supported an early version of social facilitation theory. So kind of, again, here the idea is that the presence of someone heightens your arousal. In return, that will improve your performance. So again, fishing rods, you're fishing alone, you're reeling in a fish. If you do so, compare the rate of reeling in the fish by yourself versus in front of a crowd. Triplett found that people who are reeling in a fish in front of a crowd reeled it in faster due to, in his view, this social facilitation theory. But through time, the theory was remixed or modified, as all theories are. So in 1965, we have Zajunk. Apologize if you are listening. That is probably not how you pronounce your name. So the revision that others facilitates one's dominant response, which was the first definition I provided, but the original definition by Triplett more or less is kind of arousal, which improves performance. Now we have this idea that others facilitates one's dominant response. The mere presence of others does not always improve or decrease performance. It facilitates, again, one's dominant response. So what does that mean in practice? If the task is simple or practiced, the dominant response is to do something well, and an audience will improve performance. If the task is complex or newly learned, such as analyzing 18th century political economic theory, learning the piano for the first time, the dominant response will be to make mistakes, and that an audience will impair performance. Fishing / piano example, so kind of circling back around, your dominant / automatic / practice response is to reel faster or play more accurately. In this context, you having an audience will improve your performance. So kind of the idea here of this kind of remix, this updated social facilitation theory, is not that that being around another person will improve your performance, but rather it'll increase the probability of your dominant response. So the thing that you are more likely to do. So in the case of, if something is, or I should say the task is new, it's complex, it's challenging, you're a rookie, you're just starting, you're playing the piano for the first time, you're doing some kind of research in some complex theory or explanation or whatever it is, you're playing a sport for the first time, you're going to suck, you're going to make mistakes in general, just by yourself. That's part of learning. Now, in this context of new information, of a challenging task, your dominant response, therefore, will to make mistakes at a higher rate than you previously would alone. So the audience in this case is impairing performance because that would be your dominant response, regardless of them there or not. Versus a fishing and piano example. So if you're an expert fisher, you're an expert pianist, you're dominant, you're automatic, you're unconscious kind of neurological processing of that behavior. Your practice response will be to perform the task at a higher, more effective rate. Thus, again, your dominant response is because you're an expert, is to be good at it. The audience will theoretically improve your performance. Role of evaluation. In addition to a heightened arousal, a social context includes potential for social judgment. Social judgment increases with increased attention during an important task. Performance in front of others. Some scholars argue that the threat of social evaluation tends to bring distracting thoughts to the mind, such as self-defeating worries, and drain working memory capacity required for abstract reasoning. There are fewer cognitive resources to complete the intended task. Performance and expertise. Expertise means practicing to the point that certain actions become automatic. You no longer need to focus your conscious stream of attention on the step-by-step elements of a task. The threat of social evaluation prompts dropping routine performance and initiating of mental movement micromanagement, increasing probability of reduced performance. So when performing a behavior in a social context, this also can theoretically increase the idea in the saliency of social judgment. So being judged by other people, being evaluated by other people. This evaluation can impact your performance as stated. And the best way to demonstrate this is through this expertise. So when you're an expert in something, you're not necessarily always kind of thinking through step-by-step processes. It is automatic, almost unconscious. It can run on autopilot. You can watch someone performing a task and you ask them what they're doing and how exactly they're doing it or what they're doing. You want an explanation on how to be better. And often the expert doesn't know how to explain it. That is partially because the process is automatic. They're not consciously thinking about it. Expertise allows for an unconscious, high level of proficiency in a given task. Now, this automatic processing allows for you to think about other things or use your conscious energy, your working memory on something else while you're completing this other task. Now, in the context of social judgment, wherein you believe that you're being evaluated, or maybe you start thinking to yourself, oh man, I'm actually really crap. You get in this self-defeating worrying spiral. Now, all of a sudden, you're focusing on those step-by-step processes. You're removing that expertise cognitively from kind of automatic processes that you're not thinking about. It's unconscious in nature. And now you're thinking about the tasks that you're performing, the sports that you're playing, the video game that you're playing. You're now consciously thinking about it. And in that context, wherein now you're thinking about each step one at a time as you're playing basketball, football, volleyball, whatever video game, you increase the risk and reduce performance. So not only are you removing that kind of that process from automatic cognition to more conscious parts of your cognitive processes, but at the same time, you're also thinking about, oh shit, people are judging me. So now you have competing like cognitive thoughts, kind of draining the capacity for you to perform well on this task. So the classic coach saying is, don't think about it, just play. It's kind of the idea is what they're getting at here. Just allow your automatic processes to carry you. Don't overthink it, or you can decrease performance. Social loafing. This is operationally defined as the tendency to exert less effort when performing as part of a collective or group than when performing as an individual. Next, let's walk through the predictors of why people social loaf. The first, low accountability. This means they feel that their contribution to the group's outcome will not be recognized. Giving people a way to monitor and evaluate their performance can reduce loafing, according to a 1988 study. So in this case here, it doesn't really matter if you contribute or not. If you do bad, or great, you're not going to be recognized. No one's going to know what you did or didn't do. You ultimately have little accountability towards your action, thus theoretically increasing the probability of social loafing, and why giving a way to evaluate your own performance in comparison to others can decrease social loafing. high expected effort from others. If people believe that others will work hard for the duration of tasks, they're less likely to loaf or loaf less. So if you have low expectations from other people, you're in a group project, you're like, listen, no one's doing this project. No one gives a shit. No one's doing anything. Then everybody, theoretically, everybody in the group's thinking that, and you're kind of all loafing off each other. And then you get to the project presentation day and you all have nothing and you all bomb. So high expectations, the belief that everybody in your group will work hard, decreases the probability of loafing. High perceived dispensability, focusing on two tasks, disjunctive and conjunctive tasks. Conjunctive tasks, we'll see if we can get through this without speech impediment issues. So in disjunctive task, the idea is that the most skilled member of the group determines the outcome. The team quiz show or debate team in which one genius can carry the team to a group success. The idea here, again, whoever's the best is going to determine the outcome. So I've been in like an escape room, kind of overrated, but gone to like one or two of them. And at the time, my partner that I was with, she carried, couldn't do shit. I was just like, okay, listen, I got nothing. I have no idea. I can't do any of these tasks. Ultimately, if she figures this out, we're going to win. If she doesn't figure it out, we're going to lose. But she's going to carry is kind of the idea here. On conjunctive tasks, the group will only do as well as the worst performer. So for example, in mountain climbing, the team can get up to the mountain only as fast as the slowest member. So because you're all connected together, if one person's taking a long time, you're going to take a long time. If that person falls off the mountain, they could bring down multiple people. So in this case here, the group will only do well as their worst performer. So research shows that when groups' tasks are disjunctive, the most skilled members of the group make the greatest effort, whereas the least skilled members are more likely to slack off. On conjunctive tasks, the least skilled members exert the greatest effort, and the most skilled members are more likely to slack off. That's because, again, conjunctive task, the group success depends on the slowest/worst performers, and thus the person who's the best can kind of coast a little bit. Like, okay, I'm running way far ahead in this race. I can slow down. It ain't that real. Versus in a disjunctive task, wherein it's the most skilled members who will determine the outcome of the whatever the skill that's being performed is. The most skilled members of the group in these tasks, these disjunctive tasks, are more likely to show the greatest effort. Wherein and conversely, the least skilled members are more likely to slack off, again, because the idea is that, okay, it doesn't really matter what I do. I'm bringing nothing to the table. The experts are going to carry us in the trivia. They're going to carry us in the escape room. Whatever it is, our outcome is in that person's hands. So it doesn't really matter what I do. Therefore, a greater probability that I socially loaf. Other predictors include a low valuing of a group, and uninteresting tasks that lack personal meaning or come without attractive reward. Most participants are randomly sorted to abstract temporary groups, which they probably don't care much about what that group is trying to accomplish. But in the real world, people belong to groups that they value, and they perform group activities that feel like extensions of their identity. Value and identification has been found to be negatively correlated with loafing. That is, as value and identification increases, loafing decreases. Groups that both tend to focus on maintaining relationships are less likely to loaf than are more agentic and individualistic groups, such as North American males. People loaf less when they find the task interesting, personally meaningful, or rewarding. So a couple points here. One, research design. So kind of a kind of meta commentary on research design, wherein social loafing can be measured by just sorting people and participants randomly into a group. So whatever, the printers group, the water bottle group, just making up something. That group has no historical meaning to that person. It is a temporary abstract group that they belong to, and the results of these research should be interpreted kind of with that limitation, just kind of a limitation of kind of experimental design in a lab setting. This could therefore suggest that rates of social loafing increase or decrease depending on the scenarios. In this case here, we're walking through them. But ultimately, kind of a limitation of research in a lab setting is that these groups that you assign participants to are completely made up. But as stated in the real world, groups matter. They are part of your identity. They represent your values. And thus, when you engage in a group activity, that behavior, that activity is an extension of yourself. It is and your collective. And in that context, wherein the actions that you're performing represent you, your values, your group, which is kind of the source of these, or one source of these values and identity, in that context, and you care about that group, you are far less likely to loaf than people who don't value the group or don't identify with the group, or cultures who are where individualistic behaviors are prioritized, or at least in that given setting. You can imagine a scenario where you're kind of an abstract group and you're like, I don't give a shit about this group. I'm just going to kind of do my own thing. So again, people loaf less when they find the task interesting, meaningful, and rewarding. So kind of straightforward here. You're performing a task in a group and you're like, okay, this task, I don't care that we have to count 9,000 beads are laying on the ground and we have to count each and then sort them into different color things or whatever. Meaningless. It's not interesting. Who cares? In that context, in a group of 20 people, have a greater probability of loafing because they don't care about it. It's not meaningful. It's not interesting. But in a context where the task is meaningful, it's rewarding, it's interesting, and you care about the group, you value your group members, you see your actions as representing the group, you don't want to let your group down, you don't want other people to maybe value your group less because maybe you want more people to join your group. In that case, your social loafing you have a greater probability of not social loafing. De-individualization. This is operationally defined as a tendency to lose one's sense of individuality when in a group or a crowd. This can be described as the opposite of heightened self-awareness. A 1986 review of newspaper accounts of 60 lynchings of Black Americans in the United States between 1899 and 1946, the most violent killings were carried out by large crowds in hooded mobs. There are certain conditions which make de-individualization more likely. Overstimulation by sights and sounds, high cognitive load, physiological arousal, especially in large group sizes, and few cues distinguishing individuals in a crowd. So kind of reviewing back, circling back around to that 1986 study, wherein the most violent forms of lynching in this 1986 study were found to be carried out when people were in large groups or hooded mobs. So here, maybe the hooded mobs, for example, kind of Ku Klux Klan, kind of allowing for a person's their identity to be hidden. And in that context, your identity is hidden. Therefore, you feel like you have less personal accountability is kind of one interpretation of that finding. There are other interpretations. For example, we talked about ritual-laden values within a given society or culture. So in this case here, there's very good research on kind of the cultural values associated with lynching, wherein people would bring kind of like their whole family as like a whole gathering kind of situation. So it's important to keep in mind that these norms, these culturally latent values are themselves kind of value neutral. That is, norms and cultural values exist in all cultures. However, the pro-social nature, the cruelty of norms and the values within a culture vary. So everybody has norms and values in their groups, in their countries, and those norms and values will reflect kind of the values that are consistent with the greater social and economic and political expectations of people. But as stated, they are not automatically good. They just exist. So in this case here, norms related in a Jim Crow / a little before late 19th century, early 20th century United States in the South. These lynchings can act as roles that people take on to enforce certain values or norms, and of course, racist fundamentally. Moving on, de-individualization may help account for especially egregious actions. But it's important to note that bad behavior is not an inevitable consequence of being in a large group. If the salient cues in the situations are to do something positive, the de-individualization can foster pro-social behavior. In one study, female participants were asked to wear the same nurse's uniform rather than lower quality robes that participants wear in similar studies. Individualization was associated with less aggression towards a stranger. So again, kind of the idea here is that de-individualization in groups or big groups do not equal bad. This is kind of like an old school, like 30 years ago kind of frame that still kind of, I feel like, was around in the early aughts, the 2000s or so. probably reflecting kind of U.S. Cultural values at the time. But this is not the case. Research does not support this. Bad behavior is not inevitable in large groups. And as stated, depending on the group, and what the goal is, whatever it is, a political organization, social organization, religious organization, economic organization, whatever it is, and they, for example, are pursuing pro-social values, pro-social goal. In that context, de-individualization in a large group can contribute to lower aggression or greater pro-social values. In that case, the collective, again, kind of acting as a collective identity, a source of, again, a little woo here, social energy that you kind of can feel in that group, which increases the probability of that group's values, whatever. In this case, pro-social behavior. So de-individualization, large group, does not auto equal bad, but bad things can happen in them. Group decision-making. The benefits of group decision-making can be subverted by two psychological processes. The first we'll talk about is group polarization. This is a tendency for group discussion to shift group members toward an extreme position. And groupthink, the tendency toward flawed group decision-making when group members are so intent on preserving group harmony that they fail to analyze a problem completely. Let's delve into these two constructs a little bit more. First, group polarization, according to persuasive theorists. Risky shift occurs when participants make riskier decisions as a group than they did on their own. Group polarization occurs as group discussion shifts groups towards an extreme position. This construct, group polarization, kind of took the place of risky shift. So kind of in the terminology of the field. Risky shift or group polarization exaggerates group members' initial leanings, I should say. In a 1969 study, French students who initially liked their president and disliked North Americans felt stronger in both directions after group discussions. In a 2019 study, U.S. Americans use more negative, angry language, most likely because they communicate and signal a social identity with like-minded others, according to this theory. So the persuasive arguments theory, founded in 1977 by Bernstein and Vinokur, also examine the role of informational social influence. This occurs when you conform to others' actions or attitudes because you believe they know something that you don't. Learning new arguments from the group can change how people perceive the world, not just what they say to fit in. Sometimes when people share views on controversial topics with politically like-minded others, their beliefs become more accurate and less polarized, however, according to a 2019 study. Exchanging information in politically segregated, quote, echo chamber networks can amplify partisan bias, but it also can help you see the world more accurately. So when you enter into a group discussion prior to partaking in the group discussion, you theoretically have initial leanings about the discussion or the topic at hand. You feel one way or another about it, or maybe you're indifferent. But whatever, you're entering this group discussion with sets of beliefs already. And kind of the argument is, according to the persuasive theory, interpretation of group polarization. There are other theories and other ways to interpret these results. Again, why you don't say prove or something along those lines, because there are competing theories. But anyway, the argument is that people shift their positions to a more extreme position or more firm position, however you want to phrase it, during group discussion. Due to informational social influence. So in this case here, you assume that people around you know something that you do not. They are persuasive, and their persuasive qualities are going to impact how you perceive the world. So in this context, it can be more negative, more angry, in order to kind of demonstrate your collective social identity towards the group. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. The results of, or I should say, the group discussion and that process does not necessarily result in kind of negative outcomes. So, for example, this Becker 2019 study, they found that although kind of talking in quote unquote an echo chamber can amplify your partisan bias, so whatever your political party or whatever your position is, it can also help you see the world more accurately. So people in your group who are whatever, hashtag smart or something, or whatever, they're well-read and they're giving you good information, high quality information in that context, assuming that those people know something that you do not, and then modifying the way that you perceive the world can be useful. So again, and there are a lot of kind of different dynamics here wherein the outcome is negative or the outcome is more positive, and it's far beyond kind of the purposes of our class. And thus, what that outcome of these group discussions, group polarization is, can vary. Okay, even though that largely we kind of talk about it from a negative, like in greater like kind of pop culture, probably due to the cultural moment that we live in at the time. Next, we have the social comparison theories interpretation of group polarization. They really focus on normative social influence. So the result of normative social influence, which occurs when you conform to others' attitudes or actions to be liked. So you're conforming to be liked, basically. So a cycle of comparison and amplification can occur in group discussions. So for example, one person in the group tries to compare herself favorably with another group member. They want to be, quote, a better group member, so they advocate the group's position, but takes it a little further than everyone else. Quote, you guys seem to like this idea, but I love it. Seeing this, another group member tries to present himself to the group even more favorably, so he amplifies the group's position even more. Oh yeah? I will fight tooth and nail for this idea. So in this case here, you can kind of just like gas each other up, and you're just kind of, in this way, kind of doing a downward cycle or an upward cycle, depending on, I guess, what's happening here, but ultimately mutually amplifying your kind of initial sets of views through this comparative process. So we're like, okay, one person in your group chat is like, tonight we're going out, we're going downtown, we're going to get pizza, and because pizza is really good. And then your member number 2 in the group chat is like, hell yeah, I love pizza. Pizza is the greatest food ever. This place is gonna be the best. Like, pizza is my favorite food. Everybody should like pizza. And then person number 3 is like, pizza is my favorite food. This is the best pizza place on the planet. This is the best city on the planet. All the hottest people are going to the pizza place. So ultimately, whatever. You're initially just like, okay, what do we want to decide to eat? Let's get pizza. Going from that to like, this is the greatest pizza place of all time. Anybody who's anybody is at this pizza place. We're gonna have the greatest time of our life. We're all gonna make all kinds of friends and have the times of our life. Hook up with whoever we want to, and just whatever vibe, whatever it is. But ultimately, that cycle of amplification, increasing your initial leanings towards pizza. So what do group think feel like? This is kind of just explaining here. Group members feel strong pressure to agree with the majority view. They feel their voice concerns would be viewed as stupid, weak, or evil. They remain silent and censor their doubts and questions. This results in the illusion of total group agreement. A consensual agreement without debate also gives the illusion of group invulnerability and moral infallibility. So again, groupthink here, we're more intent on preserving group harmony than analyzing the problems or the situation completely. So in this case here, we want to pursue harmony, and harmony defined as like no disagreement at all. In this case here, we have strong pressure to agree with the majority view. If you step outside of it, you're like, oh, you're an idiot, or like evil. You're trying to ruin the group. And in that context where everybody's remaining silent, because they don't want to mess up, rock the boat, ruin the group, this can create an illusion where everybody agrees because no one's speaking out. But in reality, theoretically, you could have everybody disagreeing, but no one's voicing any concerns. So now we have, even though no one agrees, we have an illusion of total group agreement. And in this context, wherein everybody agrees, there's no issues that anybody can foresee, or at least will publicly say, we now have this illusion that we're invulnerable, and our moral principles within our group are infallible, unquestionable. We are in the right, and there's nothing that can make us doubt this. So full speed ahead. Groupthink is more likely to occur when group members are motivated to be liked by the group or by an opinionated group leader. They want to keep the group together, particularly if they fear that external threats or recent failures will break the group apart, and they close themselves off to new information, opinions, or perspectives. So the group could be fragile, and like, oh, we've already had an issue before. Let's not talk about it. We'll just power through. Where we have a threat to us, whatever that threat is, who's challenging our group, we got to close quarters and just like got to survive. So let's not voice concerns, and we'll just power through. and we'll be okay. But in this context where no one's voicing concerns and we're under a threat, maybe we're close ourselves off, now we have less access to information or different perspectives that could allow us to perform better as a group, whatever a task it is that we are trying to accomplish. So how does groupthink affect decision making? Group members do not gather enough information before making a decision. They're less likely to not fully consider alternative perspectives or courses of actions, and as a result, they do not make adequate plans for what to do in the event that their decisions and actions turn out badly. So we already kind of covered the first 2 bullet points, but here kind of the idea here is because you don't have information, you're closed off for whatever reason, and you believe that you're invincible and nothing can go wrong. Well, in this case, if you think you're invincible, you probably don't need a contingency plan. You don't need an alternative plan if something turns out badly. And in that scenario, the worst case scenario can happen because you're not prepared and you don't have any idea how to kind of adjust on the fly because you never discussed them. Instead, you entered into the arena, the social arena, just assuming that you would rock it. You instead got rocked, and now you do not have a counterpunch, so you're in trouble. So how can we improve group decision making? By increasing group diversity. Racially diverse juries have been found, for example, to make better decisions than all white juries. Racially diverse juries exchange a wider range of information and facts and were less likely to misremember evidence, as we discussed in the case. When members of the white majority simply expected to make a decision in a racially diverse group in the United States, they took a broad perspective at the evidence at hand, according to a 2008 study. So in this case here, we have increased group diversity. So we have now kind of different kind of a cultural mix of jurors, or just people in general you can think about, who have different sources of information, different perspectives on the whatever it is, the project that you're working on, or in this case, the criminality, the guiltiness or innocence of a particular person. And those different perspectives can challenge you to think outside the box and theoretically analyze the information more and come to a more prudent decision. Even if it's not the correct decision, at least you are thinking it through, making the best available decision, and ultimately you're preparing for alternatives as well. You can reinterpret group cohesion. Rather than think of cohesion as pushing the group towards consensus, think about it as a promise to reach the best possible outcome, share constructive criticism, and prevent the group from doing something harmful. So in this case, rather than the group cohesion, the bond being purely based on consensus, instead kind of thinking it, reconceptualizing group cohesion as reaching the best possible outcome for the group, making the best possible decision given the information available, and then allowing for shared constructive criticism. Because inevitably, even the most well-intentioned people and with the best plans are going to mess up. People make mistakes, or the plan just didn't work. Something happened. Like there's a lot of variables that exist in the world, not just in your group, but in other groups as well, especially if you're trying to do some kind of large-scale change, something like that. So in the context of a well-functioning group, that sense of belonging, that sense of shared expectation and shared understanding that you're working towards a common good gives you kind of a secure base in which that you can engage in constructive criticism in a way that's positive. So you can critique yourself with the goal to being like, okay, I'm doing this not because I hate myself, not because whatever I'm the worst person, but rather, okay, how can I improve? Because everybody is doing this. We all want to improve. We all want to achieve our collective goal. So I can critique myself. I can critique other people in the service of this common struggle that we are engaged in. It is only through that process, or at least partially through to that process, that we can make alterations to our future behavior, our future plans, which allow us theoretically to function better as a group and or accomplish whatever our group goals are. You can also encourage individuality. If group members are led to believe that they are personally responsible for the outcome of their group's decisions, they're less likely to fall victim to group think tendencies. So if your group is doing something horrible, you're committing a crime, you're doing the crimes, folks. And in that case, and you believe that you can be personally liable for it, people are more likely to not fall victim to groupthink because now their ass is at stake. Plan to be objective. You can schedule distancing. This involves an implementation intention, an intention that specifies when, where, or how this group will act to avoid getting too committed to a course of action. Study participants put into discussion groups formed implementation intentions to engage in distances. They were more likely to follow through, and they made better decisions compared to groups that simply promised to get around to distancing at some point. So you need a plan to be objective. So scheduling a debrief, scheduling whatever, a constructive criticism, a struggle session kind of situation wherein you critique yourself or plan or whatever. But ultimately what you're doing is you're trying to create a little bit of distance from the group so then you can separate yourself from the group for a moment so then you can evaluate, think things through, and theoretically, again, come to a conclusion for a plan that allows you to make the best possible decision available for you. And kind of the idea with implementation intention is to directly make time to schedule distance. Not like, oh, in the future as a group we'll do X, Y, Z, and yeah, we'll get to it. But no, having a direct plan wherein when you have you lay out the plan is kind of the situation here. You schedule a time to distance. You can almost think this like New Year's resolutions were like, oh, I'll be better to people around me or something like that. And it's just this abstract thing with no really timetable to it. But instead saying, oh, my best friend Bob, who calls me on Fridays, I'm going to answer the call and talk to him for an hour. This will make me a better person. So having the plan, this increases the probability that you actually perform the actions associated with said plan to improve your rationality or group decision-making process overall. What makes a leader effective? Well, effective leaders focus on the needs of their followers. A very controversial take from Bass in 1985. There are three types of leaders that we will talk about in this class. The first, charismatic leaders who emphasize bold action to inspire belief in the greatness of the group. Task-oriented leaders are more practical, focused on achieving the group's goals. And relationship-oriented leaders was focused on fostering equality, fairness, harmony, and participation among group members. There are none of these leadership types are more effective than the others in every context. Rather, leadership effectiveness depends on a match between the leadership type and the situation, the circumstances, the material conditions, your environmental context. Task-oriented leaders are most effective in these highly structured situations because there's less need to attend to interpersonal dynamics and a greater need to keep everyone on track toward common goals. So in this case here, we have a highly structured task. We got a deadline today by 5 p.m. Let's get it going. You don't really have to care about the interpersonal dynamics. It just, what you need is keep everyone in goal. Let's get this deadline and move on with our life. In other work situations, group members are confused about what they should be doing and often have a difficult time working together. In this context, relationship-oriented leaders are the most effective, as they can attend to people's feelings and relationships and get the group to work together more smoothly. So in this case, maybe the group is confused, there's a little bit of tension. In this case here, relationship-oriented leaders, wherein they're fostering harmony, participation, and equality, can be more effective than other types of leaders. Effective leaders, there is very limited correlational research on this. They have high traits of extroversion, openness to experience, and conscientiousness, and they're more confident in their own leadership abilities. In a 1987 study, analyzed 100 attributes of the past U.S. presidents, including dozens of personality variables, and found no correlation between personality traits and historians' assessments of the leadership's effectiveness. So kind of a classic psychology study wherein there's very limited correlational research on these the effectiveness of the leaders, what quote unquote personality traits are associated with effective leaders for a whole host of reasons. One, because as stated before, the developmental conditions that you're in, the circumstances, the challenges are going to vary due to a whole host of historical factors. Thus, theoretically, one single personality type is not going to be the most effective. Within reason, of course. So in this year, this Simultan study of 1987, basically looking at the big five. I'm just making this up. The big five of all the past U.S. presidents, and what they found was no correlation between these personality traits and how effective the presidents were. Now, granted, again, how do you operationally define effectiveness? You can just say a historian's effective assessments, but there's going to be theoretical ideological differences on historians' assessments. So even there, it's kind of difficult to measure what is effectiveness, because you have to ultimately define what effectiveness means, which can, again, vary due to your, partially or due to your ideological commitment. But ultimately, the kind of point here is that there is not just one uniform personality profile of leaders that predicts whatever effective policies or outcomes. Humans' social developmental outcomes are far, far, far too complex for that. But how does power change people? It can loosen inhibitions. Just as people with power have greater access to and control over resources, they also have greater freedom to do as they please. In contrast, those with little power and from working class face many constraints on what they can do or be. Keltner and colleagues in 2003 argued that these material and social positions creates a mindset of behavioral approach for those in greater power positions, but a mindset of behavioral inhibition for those in lesser power positions. So kind of the argument here is somebody who's very wealthy or whatever, has a very high political position versus a person who is not wealthy, working class, among the working poor, whatever it is, and don't have a high-ranking political position / don't have political positions. These constraints impact your kind of behavioral approaches to the world. So you just kind of think this through. People with a lot of power have more control over resources, have greater access to information, so greater material resources, greater intellectual resources available to them, and greater freedom to do what they want. While working class people, you're poor, you don't really get to decide what you want to do. You have to go to work every single day, can't really talk back to your manager, you're going to get fired. You have a lot of constraints on your life. And so again, the argument being that these material and social positions influence a person's mindset, with people in greater power positions having more, or I should say higher rates of behavioral approaches, while people in lower classes having higher rates of behavioral inhibition. So approach motivation orients the person towards achieving positive outcomes and rewards. When powerful people adopt a behavioral approach orientation, they pursue their goals without too much concern for the obstacles that might stand in their way. Inhibitions or avoidance motivation orients a person towards avoiding negative outcomes and punishment. So you can imagine in a lower class person who doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have a lot of material resources, or living paycheck to paycheck, if they're doing so. In that context, you want to inhibit some of your behaviors, your certain mindsets, because, your boss is being annoying. You don't want to call him an asshole because you're going to get fired. And now, oh shit, I have nothing. I have no money. So I'm trying to, more likely to try and avoid confrontation, inhibit what I think, how I feel, and because to do so, to not inhibit, is to put yourself at risk for losing everything. While people in more powerful positions, they're having this mindset of behavioral approach, wherein you're working towards a goal and sort of some kind of reward. In this context, powerful people are much more likely to be unconcerned with kind of obstacles that might stand in their way. They got the resources, they have the greater freedom to act, and thus they're going to pursue their ambitions with less inhibition than poorer people. A sense of power can also increase a feeling of distance between the self and others, allowing for the kind of abstract thought needed to make complex decisions. It can make it easier for those in power to achieve more and solve thorny problems that face the group, but can also disinhibit people from harming people with less power, according to a 2006 study. So when making kind of big, real-world, massive decisions that affect the world or your relationships with other countries or other large groups, whatever it is, you need kind of a level of abstraction to play with these complex ideas. You have citizens that you theoretically care about, but you don't really interact with them. They're just kind of an abstract concept. Now, that abstraction can increase and decrease depending on the circumstances, but one issue that can result from this kind of abstraction is that although it allows a powerful leader to kind of maybe engage in problem solving, but at the same time, this kind of abstraction can kind of decrease the humanity of people, of your citizens, because they are not a physical person now. They are an abstraction, an idea, and maybe you can rationalize it. Those people are lower in the hierarchy for whatever reason, while I'm higher in the hierarchy for whatever reason. So I have to make the tough decisions. Those people are abstract. Maybe less human on some regards. They're just lower in kind of the social totem pole, and thus I'm less inhibited in my actions, even if those actions harm those people. So I got to solve this problem. It is what it is. Some people are going to be harmed. The lowest people are going to be harmed. But hey, I solved it, and it's not that big of a deal. So it's kind of that inhibition towards harming people lower off in power than you can decrease. Thus, kind of the distance between yourself and others. Du Bois and colleagues in 2015 found that upper class individuals, those with income/power, were more unethical than poor individuals, but only in situations in which acting unethically would benefit them personally. So having high power doesn't make you unethical per se. It just makes you more likely or more willing to do whatever serves your selfish interests. East Asian countries, however, where the norm is to orient it to others, a high SES has been found to be associated with more concern for others, according to a 2018 study. So in the Western context, in this 2015 study, these with upper class individuals, they found that they were upper class individuals were more likely to engage in unethical behavior, but specifically in decision making in situations wherein engaging in that unethical behavior will benefit them personally. If the action is unlikely to benefit them personally, the upper class individual had little to no differences with the poor individual. So, however, that kind of material interest contributing to a more unethical or increasing the probability of more unethical behaviors, according to this 2015 study. Next, we have lower rates of empathy. That is, less able to empathize with or to be charitable to those without. This raises the possibility that people in positions of power are less compassionate towards their subordinates or those who are disadvantaged. More direct evidence for this comes from studies showing that people from higher SES backgrounds, high SES or high class, can be less generous and charitable than people from lower social classes. Just a side note, SES never has a universal definition. This can range from educational outcomes, income, wealth, neighborhood. Thus, kind of what they're trying to get is class, and they're trying to figure out how to measure it. So whatever, SES. So in one study, people who were simply reminded of how they are financially better off than others recommended that people give about 3% of their income to charity, whereas those led to think about their disadvantage in society recommended giving almost 5% of one's income. People led to feel high in status were less supportive of redistribution policies aimed at reducing economic inequality in society than were people led to feel low in status. Having lower status can make people more generous because it cues a sense of compassion and egalitarian values. So this is almost like a prime example of priming, of increasing the saliency of certain values associated with social roles, in this case, having high class. According to this 2010 and 2015 studies, kind of the idea here is that you're reminding people that they are financially better off, that they're wealthy. Those participants are more likely to suggest giving 3% of your income to charity, whereas if people are primed to think about how they are disadvantaged, participants are in this 2010 study suggested giving away 5% of one's income. And one interpretation is that lower status people, this kind of priming, this increasing the saliency of your lower status can bring about an increased sense of compassion and egalitarian value. So you can think of a time, so maybe this person, a higher class person, is like, they're reminded of when they were poor, whatever, they're like a college student or something. And in their mind, even if they weren't, like, oh, I remember when I struggled or something like that. That sucked. Now I have a greater likelihood of engage in compassion and egalitarian values. So whatever, view everyone as kind of like equals or something along those lines. Wherein versus if you increase the saliency of like their upper class background, this 2015 study found that people are less likely to be supportive of redistribution policy. So whatever, wealth, maybe land or something along that, whatever it is. Then if a person were led to feel low in status, they had a greater probability of supporting redistributive policies. So in this case, again, you feel low in status. You're like, oh, I remember when I didn't have a lot of money, or man, that was really hard. We can really use some like compassion and egalitarian values. Oh, okay, now I'm more likely to support redistributive policies, whatever it is, wealth, land, or whatever, comes some kind of social element. People in power positions tend to be insensitive toward less powerful others. So greater power decreases empathy, according to a 2013 study. It increases the tendency to treat others as objects in a 2008 study, and contributes to individuals raised in both Western and Asian cultures to endorse harsher punishment of others. People in power are more likely to use stereotypes to form impressions of lower status individuals, devalue or take credit for the contributions of their underlings, and bring to mind implicit prejudice towards outgroups. So, kind of as stated before, you can imagine you are a high-class person, you're very wealthy, and you need a kind of justification, a worldview why you are so wealthy while other people are not. Why are there lower status people? And there's going to be different ideological understandings of this. But kind of in the United States and kind of in the last 100 years or so, or whatever, 72, the most old study here, so about the last 60 years, these values are kind of like higher class, kind of associated with, you worked harder, whatever, you invented something, some kind of social contribution that allowed you to earn and justify your place in society. And consequently, in that context, and kind of specifically these insensitivity findings, you need kind of a counter narrative, or a narrative, I should say, an extension of that narrative for people who didn't make it. So why didn't they make it? Well, there are obviously going to be a lot of different reasons, depending on your theory. But what you can do, if you are not interested in kind of critiquing the system that you belong to, you can instead form a negative impression of those lower status people. So again, thinking them as less human, just devaluating them, relying on prejudice, like they're lazy or whatever it is. But ultimately, they're there where they are in their social position, their power position, because of what they did. And I am in my social position as a wealthy person because of what I did or whatever it is. And thus those positions are just. And consequently, theoretically, I'm much more or less likely to be sensitive to their needs because those people at the lower social ladder earned their place. They're there for a reason. And that reason is justified. Moving on to hierarchy, many groups are organized hierarchically. Some members have higher status than others. Social dominance theory. Large societies create hierarchies, and people have a general tendency to endorse beliefs that legitimize that authority. Argues division of labor that then expands beyond fixed roles stemming from, quote, biological characteristics to the creation of arbitrary sets, groups of people distinguished by culturally defined roles, attributes, and characteristics. Now, this is, again, very much debated, but social dominance theory, basically what they're arguing here is when societies eventually get large enough so that they have surplus goods, aka more goods than you need immediately. Like you can store grain, you can store food, you can have just surplus. There's profit. And then in that kind of context wherein you have surplus, you have profit, all these things, there's going to be different social roles, attribution characteristics, and some are going to be valued more than others, depending on cultural norms, social context, economic, political ideologies that are prevalent within a given country or before countries, whatever, nations or territories or stuff like that. So how is hierarchy legitimized? Generally, social reality is based on a cultural worldview that is constructed and maintained by the consensus of those who live within that reality. This means that for advantaged groups to stay in power and for group hierarchies to persist, individuals across society need to believe in the legitimacy of the leaders and the institutions that keep them in power. People generally believe in the necessity of group-based social hierarchies, but vary widely on their value. So, and for a hierarchy, for a system of rule, for a consensus reality to maintain, you have to believe that the general population needs to believe in the legitimacy of the leaders and the institutions that keep them in power. When those leaders and institutions no longer have legitimacy, their worldviews are not applicable. People do not believe in the vision of those leaders or the entirety of that project. Then new institutions and leaders can arise, or modifications to the ruling hierarchy and norms, and or political and economic values and systems within a given context. So how do people maintain faith that the existing hierarchy is real and legitimate? There are legitimizing beliefs. Legitimizing, we're going to go with that. Myths. Simplistic beliefs about why people succeed or fail in society. One myth is that anyone can get ahead in life by simply working hard enough. Because of this myth, people who are advantaged in society may, ironically, be more likely than underprivileged groups to claim that they were unfairly discriminated against. U.S. college students were asked to role-play a situation in which they were applying for a managerial position. White American participants who learned that they had been passed over for a job by a Latino American manager who favored a Latino American applicant were more likely to claim discrimination than when Latino American participants were passed over by a white American manager who favored a white American applicant. So kind of the idea here is we all have these legitimizing myths. These are stories, these are beliefs. So myths in kind of the more abstract term, beliefs about why you succeed or fail in society. And in general, they can be quite simplistic or overly simplistic. So a common one in the United States, you work hard enough, you're going to succeed. All right. So in this context, if you make it to the top, you're going to think, oh, I worked hard enough. And people at the bottom who don't make it, they didn't work hard enough. So consequently, people who are already advantaged in society, so whatever, you're a wealthy college student or you're a wealthy person, you have a highly powerful position. So now you're at the top of society. Therefore, you're like, okay, and you have the belief and the myth that you got there by working hard, simply only by working hard. You're only there because you're the best, all right? So in that context of wherein you're already advantaged, when something bad happens to you, when you're passed over, you're like, what the fuck? Like, well, this myth exists. I'm clearly the best. It's now been violated. So what is happening? So in this case here, white American participants learning they were passed over, they're like, wait, this makes no sense. I am all clearly at the top of my social hierarchy because I worked hard enough. So therefore, injustice has been brought upon me. Therefore, I'm going to file a claim of discrimination. So as such, people in society who are most advantaged may be, ironically, can be more likely than underprivileged groups to claim that they are unfairly discriminated against because that expectation that they worked hard enough, they already hold their position for a reason. How can this new thing happen to me that's bad? It makes no sense. It's inconsistent with the legitimizing beliefs of myself and my country. System justification theory, believing in stereotypes that seem to explain why some individuals are more advantaged than others. For example, someone high in power stereotypes homeless people as being lazy and dangerous, then it's possible to explain why they suffer without questioning that the hierarchy is fair and good. So kind of straightforward here, you're justifying the system. So again, hierarchy, you got some people high, some people low. Why are people at the bottom? Well, why are there homeless people? One reason you can have is that they are lazy, they're dangerous, they screwed up, it's their fault, they didn't work hard enough. Okay, so what that allows is a way to explain away the existence of homeless people without questioning whether your cultural, your economic, your political, your social system is fair and good. Instead, you're not critiquing the system, you're justifying the system by saying the people, these and specifically homeless people in this case here, screwed up, it's their fault, the system's fine, it's on them to fix themselves. Thus, you justify the system and you've maintained a legitimacy of the hierarchy within your whatever country, state, area. Continuing on, other ways to legitimize hierarchy, idealizing high status. So there can be in-group bias, so favoring your in-group versus another group. But interestingly, one remarkable observation is that some members of the disadvantaged groups actually show a preference for the higher status group over their own group. So a group, so a high status group, maybe they're there, presumably they're unjustifiably, but the person in the lower social group, rather than identify with their own group and whatever their struggle, whatever it is, they say they have a preference for the highest status group. So they want to be like that high status group. There's also mitigating comparisons. Specifically, we're going to look at one form, which is complementary stereotypes. They portray groups with a mix of positive and negative characteristics. For example, after reading stories about people who are poor yet happy versus poor and sad, or rich yet corrupt versus honest, people saw the system as fairer. Groups that are socially disadvantaged appear satisfied with their lives, and when groups that are especially well off look miserable or untrustworthy. Consider, for example, how wealthy individuals are often depicted in popular movies. When members of disadvantaged groups endorse seemingly positive stereotypes for their group, where, quote, we're broke but we're kind, they may be inadvertently promoting the very social system that keeps them in the disadvantaged place. So basically what these complementary stereotypes allow is, again, for the continued legitimacy of the hierarchy. So we have a mix of positive and negative characteristics. So just as a example, you would think a regular person would think, or whatever, it would be common to think poor and miserable, rich and happy, something along those lines. But when we read stories of poor yet happy, rich versus sad, now what we're doing is kind of framing poverty and wealth, not kind of inevitably resulting in happiness or misery. Because the socially disadvantaged groups, they're satisfied with their lives. They're happy where they are. And the rich people, even though they're wealthy, listen, they still have a lot of things going on in their life. It's tough. It's tough out there for a rich person. So due to that kind of mix of individual characteristics of a person, which seems to fluctuate, or at the very least, that poor people are happy, this now gives credibility to the hierarchy that exists. The social order that exists is legitimate because although these people are poor, they still report being happy. They seem to be fine with it. And there's no determinative outcome associated with being poor. You can still be poor and yet happy. Therefore, you do not need to change the social system. Rather, it's maybe changing your outlook on life or something along those lines. And similarly, when disadvantaged groups state something like, hey, we're broke, but we're really kind, you're basically saying, well, you can implicitly be saying two things. One, in general, people who are broke are not kind. And then two, listen, although we are broke, we're still kind. So I'm able to individually persevere. And thus, again, the system is not inevitably illegitimate. There's still hope out there. The social order can still be maintained. We don't really have to change anything. Everybody is a mix of positive and negative things. And therefore, it's up to you to kind of sort through those positive and negative things and kind of make the best of it. Thus, allowing for the system to persevere, and theoretically, where groups who are oppressed and are purposely in the bottom of the social, economic, political hierarchy, kind of giving legitimacy to the hierarchy that keeps them in their oppression. Because again, you're moving the critique away, that kind of personal narratives, those anecdotes, kind of redirect energy away from critiquing the current form of the hierarchy, the legitimacy of it, and redirecting towards kind of like individual positive and negative characteristics, which challenge kind of the idea of stating the system is illegitimate. We also have the relative deprivation theory. To acknowledge a sense of disadvantage requires a comparison with others who are more advantaged. We tend to compare ourselves with similar others or those who are close by, because societies tend to segregate themselves socially and physically on the basis of class membership and other similarities. We most often compare ourselves with people like us, people who may also be disadvantaged in the same way. Focus on how their life compares to their neighbors, and they don't see the larger societal patterns that constrain them. So kind of the idea of relative deprivation theory is that hierarchy can be maintained because you look outside and you're like, oh, everybody's just like me. Everybody is also poor, or everybody also lives in the suburbs. Other people are also all rich. But ultimately, all you see is people within your same class, and also typically in the United States, same race, but granted, there's suburbs shifted up a little bit, but still class race. But ultimately, in those conditions, you have a relatively reduced sense of disadvantage because you don't have something to compare your life to. You don't see a different life. You can't see the more advantaged people. They could be behind gated communities. It can be in a whole different country, but you don't see it. You can't compare yourself, and thus, okay, well, that's just how the world is. Therefore, the system is just. It's legitimate because it's just kind of a fact of social being. Let's wrap it up with predictors of collective action. Collective action can be operationally defined as efforts by groups to resist and change the status quo in the service of group goals. Less willingness to engage in collective action is associated with higher motivation to defend the status quo. That is, they are higher in system justification. It's related to less willingness to engage in collective action, such as joining protests/organizations. More willingness to engage in collective action and a belief that the system is illegitimate and unstable with impermeable group boundaries. This means that they don't see many opportunities to exit their disadvantaged group and get into a more advantaged group. As a result, they identify more strongly with the in-group, which motivates them to take actions to raise the group's status. All right, so stopping here, kind of straightforward kind of fundamentals of collective action. That is, you're less willing to engage in collective action if you have higher levels of system justification and a higher motivation to defend the status quo. Kind of straightforward here. You believe in the system. You believe in the legitimacy of the whatever the hierarchy is, or the norms, values, and systems are. Therefore, you're less willing to engage in collective action to challenge them. And your more willingness to engage in collective action when you believe the system is illegitimate and unstable. And the groups are impermeable. So kind of the idea here is that you believe the system is illegitimate. It is not the correct way to view the world. It's disadvantaged, it's oppressive to whatever groups. And ultimately, you believe those groups are social in nature. They're not permanent. They're not laws of nature. You can create new groups or new ways of understanding, new values, new systems, institutions through collective action to create a new world, a new country, whatever it is. Next, identity fusion, strong feelings of, quote, oneness with the group. Recall that the social identity perspective argues people distinguish between their personal identity, that is, aspects of the self that make people unique, and their social identity, aspects of self that align people with groups. The salience of these two identities ebbs and flows depending on the context. But for strongly fused individuals, the boundary between, quote, me and we dissipates. They feel, quote, fused to the group like a stone fused to the wall. To measure identity fusion, researchers adapted the inclusion of other in the self scale, originally developed to measure attachment in close relationships. People report high overlap of self in group identities, are more willing to act for the good of the group, even if it means sacrificing their own well-being. Okay, so we have this identity fusion. We have now this oneness. Our personal identity and our social identity have fused, have become one. Now we is me. To act in the group is to act for my own intrinsic motivations. I am the group is me. We are working towards some kind of collective action, whatever it is, changing some policy, changing some system, creating a country, or whatever it is. And in that context, when your self and group identities fuse together at higher rates, this gives people, again, kind of courage and a sense of meaning and connection that increases the likelihood that they will engage in sacrificial behavior even against their own well-being. So something that because they see the group's action as something bigger than themselves. They are interconnected, they have meaning to the group, but also the historical legacy of the group that they identify with, even if it's false, thus their actions today can echo across time, theoretically. And I only include that attachment measurement point to state again, you can reconceptualize attachment, not just between parent-child or child-guardian, but there are other types of attachment here. In this case here, you have attachment to the group to such an extent that, again, that me becomes we, and you're ready to act, ready to do what needs to be done with varying levels of sacrifice and what that specifically means in your given developmental context, but ultimately to engage in collective action because you believe that this system is illegitimate and you are going to attempt to change it. And as such, you needed to be able to depend on your friends, your members within that organization to work together. And thus, you need that collective identity and able to perform collective action. All right, everyone. With that said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great week. Bye.